He had commanded the most powerful air force the world had ever seen. He wore the rank of Reich Marshal, the highest military rank in Germany, and he had once stood before his pilots and promised them, on his personal honor, that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. His name was Hermann Göring, and on the afternoon of May 16, 1945, he sat in a small office in Augsburg, Germany, wearing no medals, his rank stripped of its shine, and answered questions from the men who had beaten him. What he said that afternoon is one of the most honest confessions ever made by a defeated commander in history. The school was called Ritterschule, a name that translates, with some irony, to Knight's School. The interrogation took place from 1700 to 1900 hours, 2 hours that stretched like a lifetime. Göring stood in a small office when the Americans arrived. He wore a grayish wool uniform, with no medals on his chest, only the epaulets of a field marshal, a large eagle, a small swastika, and crossed batons. On the third finger of his right hand, he wore a silver ring. His face was described by the American historian present, Dr. Bruce Hopper, as blue-eyed and ruddy, not unpleasant. He was not the wrathful, boasting showman who had strutted across Europe in the early war years. He was quiet. He sat down. He talked. Across from him sat General Carl A. Spaatz, commanding general of the United States Strategic Air Forces. Lieutenant General Hoyt S. Vandenberg was also in the room, along with Brigadier General E. P. Curtis and Major Alexander de Seversky, a special consultant to the Secretary of War. These were the architects of the American air campaign over Europe, the men whose bombers had turned German cities to ash, whose fighters had followed those bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Göring knew exactly who they were. He had known their aircraft intimately, the way a man knows the face of someone who has hunted him for years. The Americans did not begin with accusations. They began with a simple question: what had gone wrong? And Göring, with the war now irreversibly over, with nothing left to protect, told them. To understand the weight of what Göring confessed in that room, you have to feel what he believed at the start. In the early years, he had told anyone who would listen that Germany's skies were inviolable. He had built the Luftwaffe from nothing, the finest air force in the world, and he was proud of it in the way a craftsman is proud of something he shaped with his own hands. He had promised the German people, with the public confidence of a man who truly believes his own words, that no enemy bomb would ever fall on Berlin, that no enemy aircraft would ever reach the German capital. He had staked his name on it. That promise felt reasonable in 1940. The Luftwaffe had swept through Poland in September 1939 like a killing wind. It had helped shatter France in weeks in May and June of 1940. Its bombers had battered Britain throughout that long summer and autumn, and while the Battle of Britain had not gone exactly as planned, Germany still controlled the skies above most of Europe. What air force in the world could reach Berlin and fight its way back home? The distances alone seemed to make it impossible. England was hundreds of miles away. America was an ocean away. And whatever America could build, Göring had reportedly said so, in one form or another, would be refrigerators and automobiles, not war machines capable of challenging the Luftwaffe. But something was changing, slowly and then all at once, in the way that decisive things change in war. In the interrogation room, General Spaatz asked the question directly. When did you know that the Luftwaffe was losing control of the air? Göring's answer was immediate. He did not pause to consider a diplomatic phrasing. He said, when the American long-range fighters were able to escort the bombers as far as Hanover, and it was not long until they got to Berlin. That single sentence carried the whole architecture of German aerial strategy inside it. The Luftwaffe's plan had always depended on a gap, a range gap. American and British bombers could fly deep into Germany, but without fighter escort, they were exposed. German interceptors could attack them freely. The bombers paid a terrible price. The raids on Schweinfurt in 1943 had proved that, with losses so severe that the Americans were forced to suspend deep penetration missions entirely for a time. The range gap was Germany's shield. As long as no Allied fighter could follow the bombers deep into the Reich, the Luftwaffe could bleed the American air forces white. Time and distance were on Germany's side. Hanover broke that belief. When American long-range fighters, P-51 Mustangs equipped with drop tanks, external fuel canisters they could shed once empty, began appearing alongside bombers over central Germany, the range gap began to close. And Göring knew, sitting in that room, that once it reached Hanover, it would reach Berlin. It was not a question of if. It was a question of when. That when arrived in March 1944. Imagine what he saw, or rather what he heard. Reports coming in that Allied single-engine fighters, not bombers, fighters, had been sighted over the German capital, the city that Göring had promised would never be touched, the city that symbolized the invincibility of the Third Reich. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's head of the fighter arm and one of the most skilled combat pilots Germany produced, decided to see it for himself. He climbed into a Focke-Wulf 190 alongside another general officer and flew toward the reported area. What he found confirmed the worst. The Mustangs found them first. The other general was shot down. Galland escaped only by firing his machine guns forward. The streams of smoke and shell casings drifting backward gave the pursuing P-51 pilots the illusion that they were being fired at from behind. The ruse worked. Galland turned for home, but he could not unsee what he had seen. The Mustangs were over Berlin. The shield was gone. And Göring, who had stood before the German people and sworn this would never happen, had to find a way to explain it away. The official position handed down through the Luftwaffe command was extraordinary in its denial. There were no long-range Allied fighters over Germany. The pilots who reported them were mistaken, or lying, or suffering from combat fatigue. The planes they had seen were something else. Galland, who had nearly been killed by those planes and had held their spent cartridges in his hand, was told the same thing. Remember what he had believed at the start, that the range gap was Germany's permanent protection. Here is where it breaks. Hit subscribe right now, because what Göring admitted next, sitting across from the men who broke him, changes everything. Do not go anywhere. In the interrogation room, spots kept pressing. The questions moved from tactics to something deeper. Production, numbers, the weight of American industrial power. And Göring, sitting with no medals on his chest and nowhere left to retreat, gave an answer that no propaganda ministry would ever have approved. He said, "The Americans are superior technically and in production." 6 words that stood in direct contradiction to everything Germany had told itself throughout the war. Superior technically, superior in production, not equal, not comparable, superior. He went further. When asked about the January 1, 1945 attack on Allied airfields, a massive operation in which the Luftwaffe deployed 2,300 aircraft to hit Allied bases in France and Belgium, he was asked why German forces had not come back for a second strike. His answer was a small, devastating detail. Hitler said it was no good to bomb American planes because more of them would come like bees. Sit with that for a moment. The Führer of the Third Reich, the man who had built his entire military philosophy on the idea of German superiority, had looked at American aircraft production and concluded that killing American planes was pointless, because there would always be more. Bees. That was the word Hitler used. Not a swarm that could be dispersed, not a force that could be defeated, but something biological and automatic and endless. Kill 1, 2 more appear. Kill 100, 1,000 more appear. Galland had already written this into the record from the inside. In a report to the Air Ministry in 1944, filed formally, not spoken in a defeated prisoner's room but written during the war itself, he stated, "Between January and April, our daytime fighters lost over 1,000 pilots. They included our best squadron, Group A, and Geschwader commanders. Each incursion of the enemy is costing us some 50 aircrew. The time has come when our weapon is in sight of collapse." In sight of collapse. Galland was not a man given to panic or theatrics. He was the officer who, during the Battle of Britain, had famously told Göring, when Göring asked his pilots what he could give them, "I should like an outfit of Spitfires for my Jagdgeschwader." He said it because it was true. He was a man who looked at aircraft and told the truth about them. When he wrote that the fighter arm was in sight of collapse, it was already collapsing. One of the quieter confessions in Göring's interrogation touched not on machines, but on men. General Spaatz asked whether American bombing had affected the German training program. Göring answered without hesitation. Yes. For instance, the attacks on oil retarded the training because our new pilots could not get sufficient training before they were put in the air where they were no match for your fighters. Think about what that sentence contains. The American campaign against German oil facilities, the synthetic fuel plants, the refineries, the infrastructure that turned raw material into aviation gasoline, had achieved something no direct attack on Luftwaffe airfields ever fully could. It had stolen time from German pilots before they ever flew a combat mission. The cycle that builds a competent fighter pilot requires hundreds of hours in the air. Formation flying, gunnery practice, aerobatics at altitude, mock combat against experienced instructors. That cycle requires fuel. When fuel becomes scarce, the cycle is cut short. Pilots graduate with 30 hours of flight time instead of 150. They are put into aircraft they cannot fully control, against enemies who have trained for years. Göring was describing, in his precise and careful way, the mechanism by which American air power had consumed the Luftwaffe's future pilots before those pilots could become a threat. It was not only a bombing campaign, it was a campaign against competence itself. And it worked. The pilots sent up to face American bomber formations in 1944 were, in many cases, boys who had been rushed through training programs, stripped to the bone by fuel shortages caused by the very bombs they were being sent to stop. They were not ready. They knew it. Their commanders knew it. And now, in a schoolroom in Augsburg, the man who had been their commander-in-chief was telling the Americans exactly how effectively they had done it. Spaatz asked Göring which had done more damage, area bombing, the British approach of targeting cities broadly at night, or American precision bombing, which targeted specific industrial facilities and infrastructure in daylight. Göring's answer surprised no one in that room, but it is worth holding carefully. The precision bombing, because it was decisive. Destroyed cities could be evacuated, but destroyed industry was difficult to replace. He said it plainly. A destroyed city was a tragedy, but a displaced population could find shelter, could survive, could eventually rebuild. A destroyed ball-bearing factory, a demolished oil refinery, a wrecked marshalling yard where rail lines converged. These were wounds that did not simply heal. Germany could not replace what American precision bombers had taken. And the Americans had understood this, had chosen their targets with a logic Göring openly acknowledged and even respected. As soon as we started to repair an oil installation, he said, you always bombed it again before we could produce 1 ton. This was the rhythm of the American air campaign from the German side. Repair and be bombed again. Begin again and be bombed again. The American Air Force did not simply destroy. It denied Germany the ability to recover. That distinction, which German leadership had perhaps not fully grasped until it was too late, is what Göring was articulating in that quiet room, speaking to the men who had applied it. There is a note in the USAFE Air Intelligence Summary, a document compiled from Göring's interrogation, that captures something he said about long-range fighters that did not make it into the formal question-and-answer record. It describes how Göring credited long-range escort fighters with delivering a major strategic blow to German planning, and considered them collectively as one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome of the war. He said he had been convinced that deep bomber penetrations were possible only with long-range escort, and that the capability of Allied fighters to provide that escort came as a complete surprise to him. He went so far as to say that when fighters actually appeared over Berlin for the first time, he knew that the eventual results would be, he used the word, tragic. Not uncertain, not difficult, tragic. This was the man who had promised Berlin was untouchable. Now he sat in a schoolroom and said that the moment he saw Allied fighters over that city, he already knew how the story ended. He had known in his body, perhaps before he fully formed the thought, that the war was lost. Not that it might be lost, not that it was becoming harder to win, but that the result was already written. The Mustangs over Berlin were not a setback, they were a verdict. There is something worth pausing on before we leave this room. Göring was not a sympathetic figure. He was, by the end, a man of extraordinary personal vanity and moral catastrophe, implicated in crimes that would be adjudicated months later at Nuremberg. He deflected blame throughout the interrogation. Hitler had made this decision. Hitler had overruled that plan. Higher headquarters had issued those orders. The pattern is consistent and self-serving. He was a man protecting whatever remained of his reputation in the only room where that reputation was still being argued. And yet, some of what he said was simply true, confirmed by other records, other officers, other interrogations. The Luftwaffe had been bled dry by the American air campaign. The training pipeline had been starved of fuel. The fighter arm had lost 1,000 pilots in 4 months. The long-range fighters had come as a genuine surprise to German planning. American industrial production had outpaced anything the Reich could match. These were not stories Göring told to win favor from his captors. They were things he said because they were facts, and because the war was over, and because the facts no longer needed to be hidden. What Galland had written in the formal quiet of a military report, and what Göring admitted in the formal quiet of a defeated man's room, amounted to the same thing. The American Air Force had not simply won battles. It had dismantled, piece by piece, the system that kept German pilots alive and German aircraft flying. It had attacked fuel and factories and training and morale, and it had done it simultaneously, persistently, and with a precision that even the defeated commander could not dismiss. So what did a captured German pilot say about the American Air Force? He said it was superior technically and in production. He said its long-range fighters were among the most decisive factors in the outcome of the war. He said its attacks on oil had stolen training time from a generation of pilots who were then sent to die without preparation. He said its precision bombing had destroyed things that cities never could, the industrial nerves of the German war machine. He said that when he saw American fighters over Berlin, he knew the result would be tragic. He was not a junior officer speaking from confusion and fear in a transit camp. He was the Reich Marshal of the German Air Force, speaking to the generals who had beaten him, 2 weeks after the war in Europe had ended. His name was Hermann Göring, and he wore no medals when he said it. The room was quiet. He had 2 hours, and he used them to tell the truth. That truth, spoken not in the heat of defeat, but in the cold clarity of its aftermath, is the confession the American air campaign earned, not just in the air, over Berlin and Hamburg and Schweinfurt, but in a small room in a school that had once trained knights. If this is the first time you've found this channel, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Every week we tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it, and there are more confessions waiting. If this episode moved you, hit like. It tells us to keep going. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We read every one. We'll see you in the next one.